Last week, I invited Sohrab Ahmari, a leading intellectual on the so-called New Right, about his own evolution from being more of a classical conservative to being a conservative who, frankly, favors more muscular state intervention when necessary to advance a proper vision of the good. Turns out, though, we only scratched the surface on a few topics, and we didn't get to some of the topics that I intended to dive deep in with him on, including, perhaps most importantly, immigration policy, but lurking underneath that, a deeper discussion about American national identity. And so I figured that we would continue that discussion this week, picking up where we left off last week, for diving deep into the future directions of the New Right and exploring whether the so-called New Right is really even one movement or itself a collection or umbrella of movements that are united by their rejection of old school Republican neoconservatism, but may have some deep rifts within their own views for the future of America. And my own view is that that's exactly where we are right now, is at the bleeding edge of defining what the future of America First actually is. You'll probably remember last week we covered a lot of trade policy, a lot of industrial policy related questions. And Sohrab, I think, was braver than many, even in the protectionist America First camp, to be able to come out and say that getting rid of the administrative state is not really a desirable or achievable possibility. As you all well know, that's something I most definitively favor, is getting rid and shutting down the fourth branch of government. But Sohrab explained to us his view that in a modern, complex, post-industrial revolution economy, it requires some level of management and administrative oversight. And the real focus of the conservative movement should be shaping that for the betterment of American workers and manufacturers and American interests, rather than abdicating the project altogether, which is a very different view than the one that I favor of getting in there and shutting it down, eyes wide open to the risks that entails nonetheless. So that was a great discussion, and I expect we're going to dive into some more of that relating to questions of industrial policy and trade policy. But if you're really interested in that discussion, check out last week's episode. What we're doing right now is diving deeper into this question of competing visions for the future of America First as it relates to immigration. And for that, I invited Sohrab back on the podcast, and I want to say thank you, man, for taking 2 weeks back to back to have this free-flowing discussion.
Oh, it's my absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me back. I know it's unusual.
Yeah, well, I want to dive into where we last left off, but I would be remiss if I didn't note that I just was at least breezing through. I didn't have a chance to carefully read it yet, but read most of what is a nearly 10,000 word essay you just wrote, among other topics on your experience using ayahuasca in Mexico and reconciling that, or even comparing that or informing that with your Catholic faith. And given that you put so much into that article, I thought it might even have some, let's just say, atmospheric relationships to the discussion we're about to have on immigration. But I thought I'd give you a chance to summarize that conversation that you had with your audience about your experience of going into tribal regions of Mexico and trying ayahuasca and what that entailed. So maybe you could say a word about what motivated you to write that piece.
Yeah, I mean, the motivation was there's this great explosion right now of questions about psychedelic medicine as an alternative to the conventional psychiatric care, which is failing Americans in many respects. You know, the system, the conventional mental health system gorges itself on some $225 billion annually, and the rates of misery are only going up as things aren't being solved. But so there's this idea that that indigenous peoples of the Americas hit upon these treatments, including ayahuasca, that are a way to overcome trauma and so on. And so I went with kind of curiosity about that. And I have to say, I don't have an easy answer to say yes, it's great, because first of all, as you mentioned, and we discussed last time, I'm a Catholic, and when I went, I didn't realize there was a whole ceremonial aspect to it. And I had to really struggle to think, can I even participate in this ceremonial dimension? Because, does that violate the first commandment? Thou shalt have no other God before me. And so I found a compromise where I would be at the ceremony and I would drink the juice or the potion, but I would not kind of participate in anything that's kind of ritual or sacramental. And then the trip, as it were, itself was, absolutely terrifying, to be honest. Everything they say is true. It's the people say it's the five hardest hours of your life, this kind of ego battering experience. And I certainly felt that. And at the end of it, you feel very good, because it takes you to like purgatory and then brings you out, and you're sort of like, wow, I love life. I get that said, I wouldn't easily recommend it, even though I've heard that,
Mm.
look, there are studies that show that it helps with PTSD, anxiety, depression, and other things like that. But it's a hard thing. And then for me, I mean, there's this kind of complexity that I grappled with, and I'm not even sure I'm fully happy with how I resolved it. I feel like I participated in like another religion ceremony in a way that is
Mhm.
prohibited to Christians, and I'm something that, I'm racked with. But I try to work it out in 10,000 words and just lay out what my thoughts were. So that might be the best
Yeah.
way to summarize something so long.
Yeah, well, that's that dimension of it. I can't leave that hanging because I think that's actually the most interesting part of it about whether the participation in some type of ritualistic activity like you did would be at all in tension with the first commandment. Why would that be the case?
Well, because it depends on how you view what happens in an ayahuasca ceremony. It's a psychedelic medicine that creates this kind of visionary state, and there are basically maestros, they call them, teachers, who also drink it, and they look at you, and in their visionary state, they sort of see what ails you, and they sing these songs that are called icaros that are supposed to heal you. And there's a debate within this community, and it touches on, if you're a Christian, it touches on like whether or not it's kosher. It's a Jewish term,
Mhm.
but whether
So
it's
to be,
okay,
so to speak. Yeah, yeah.
so to speak. Yeah. One is, is this kind of process merely a kind of indigenous technology, which is the manipulation
Mhm.
of plants, energies and intelligences that modern science has yet to catch up with? In which case, it's kind of it's not mystical. It's really
Mhm.
it's a kind of unusual healing technology. Or whether or not there's a mystical dimension to this that has to do with manipulation of plant spirits, and it's a whole indigenous American cosmology that would rival
Mhm.
the biblical one. And ultimately, I couldn't resolve it on my own. And
Mm.
like, there are moral theologians, Catholic moral theologians, who've tried to think through the use of psychedelics for therapeutic purposes, and that's okay, fine. Like, a lot of them have come to the conclusion that that might be fine. Again, it's a little bit of a gray area, but that nobody has weighed in on the use of psychedelic medicines in their ceremonial or ritual setting.
Yeah,
And there I felt like, well, I can't resolve this, but what I will do is I ask the maestros, the Indians, to not interact with me in that way, and to
and
just,
and they understood your request.
yes, yeah. I told them that this would conflict with
Yeah,
my deeply held beliefs, and of course they don't force you. But still, I mean, after the several sessions, I at the very end I thought, okay, well, this actually does, it is a rival worldview, and that's what was terrifying about it. And I sort of
yeah,
ran out of the room on the fifth one, and I said, like, I need to like go say my own prayers. I've come into something it's a rich cosmology. It deserves our respect and attempt to understand it better, and so on. But I'm not at all clear that like that resolution is one that is I'm comfortable with
yeah.
yet. You know what I mean? But
Is trying on a different set of clothes you think incompatible, as long as you sort of keep in your mind from a Catholic worldview that Christ is the Son of God and the path to truth, or is the truth?
Mhm.
And if you have that as a fixed North Star in your faith worldview,
Yeah.
is it is it really in conflict to sort of try on a different set of clothes at the same time, even just the practice of it without changing your
Yeah.
conviction?
Well, look, I mean, there is this concept of natural revelation in Catholic theology.
Mhm.
And believe me, I thought we were going to talk about immigration, but I'm happy to get into
I
this
think
stuff.
I would like to,
But
but this
but
is
but
interesting
but but
enough
the,
that I
the
want to
idea of
pause on
the
this.
idea of natural revelation, obviously, there's natural reason, which all human beings are blessed with, and that should lead you to at least to natural law, and at least to the idea that there is a God, right? That
Mhm.
reason alone suffices for that. But this idea of natural revelation is that somehow the unevangelized peoples of the world have been granted sort of partial access to the truth through their own ritual context. And
Mhm.
so, for example, there are tribes out there in Africa who completely unevangelized, whose central belief or ritual is this idea that a merciful deity comes down to their conditions, and it allows himself to be murdered by the
Mm.
community. And this act of murder of an innocent god then becomes the principle of their communal renewal and reconciliation. Which, of course, if you're
Mm.
an atheist critic of Christianity, you say, well, see, Christianity is just one more of these myths that are of the self-sacrificing deity myth. But the concept of natural theology, which is something, for example, Pope Benedict engaged with, says no. That doesn't. It's no proof against Christianity. It just shows that the world itself at its deepest layers is cruciform. That it's imbued with this yearning for a God who sacrifices himself and whose death alone can expiate our sins. And so, and that way you can sort of respect, you can approach, you can think about what these kind of indigenous practices are like and what they say about us, but still like active participation in that for an outsider is at the very least is an uncomfortable gray zone. And I lay out the discomfort in the piece.
Yeah, and can I just ask you a converse question, which is more or less orthogonal to even the discussion we've been having? Do you think that the participation in Catholic ritual by somebody who does not have full belief in the actual underlying theology, does that present the same conflict to you, or is it more of a personal conflict in the other direction?
No, because I believe Catholicism is true, and so anyone who at least comes to Mass will,
Yeah,
begin to gain access to get a
right.
taste for the sacramental life. Even although I should say, as you know, if you're not, confirmed and you're not in communion with the Roman Catholic Church, you're not supposed to take, you're supposed to eat the Eucharist. For, precisely that reason, you're not in communion yet. But lots of people do that. I mean, who come and you hear the preaching, you hear
Yeah,
those earlier elements. It used to be, like the division was very clear in the early church. It was called the Mass of the Catechumens, which was roughly the first half, hearing the Bible. It's
hmm
that everyone could come in. And then the Mass for the members of the Catholic Church, and it was like almost physically there was a sort of division between the two. The second half was not for the catechumens.
right.
So yeah, no, I would
You know,
encourage that, but it's only because I believe that one religion is the one true faith, to be clear. And so
yeah.
anyone who comes
You
and
know, in
participates
our
gets something.
and I definitely wanted you to bring me back to talk about immigration, but this is such you're drawing me into such interesting subject matter that just for a couple more minutes, okay, I want to dwell on
Sure.
a question that I mean, you brought up the Eucharist, for example, and that related to a separate conversation I was having in recent days. I get a lot of questions when I travel to these different events I'm doing across the country during my own campaign, and even now in this latter phase of it about my own faith. So I'm Hindu,
Hmm.
but many people mistake that for polytheist religion. I consider myself to actually be an ethical monotheist. I believe
Hmm.
there's one true God, and that is the supreme being that is otherwise present in all forms, but there's one true God above. And anyway, I think one of the questions that I've sort of gotten when challenged on my faith of whether or not is that a pagan belief set or not. I actually think it's not pagan. I think it is ethical monotheism is a worldview that I think many of our founders, former presidents have shared, and I think it's a worldview deeply consistent with that of the founding of this country. But in the context of those conversations, when challenged, one of the questions I got was, well, what are Hindus doing at temples with deities? And I've kind of explained, well, it's kind of the equivalent of having a symbol and a crucifix at the front of it, the temple. I bring up all of that for the reason that you brought up the Eucharist, and there was one question on my mind that I'd love to actually probe your thoughts on, especially because you were such a thoughtful, thoughtful about your journey to Catholicism here, and you brought up the Eucharist. What is your perspective on, I guess we'll call it the doctrine or the church teaching of transubstantiation? Then of like
Hmm.
the idea that the Eucharist, which you're not supposed to take until you've been baptized in the church, but that you are eating literally at that moment. It's not that you're eating something that's symbolic of the body and blood
Hmm.
of Christ, but you actually are in a
Hmm.
real sense, in that sense, eating the actual blood and body of Christ, as
Hmm.
opposed to just a symbol of it. I thought of that in the context of, and you and I are able to have free conversations, and so I like this. But I thought about it in the context of being challenged in some of the challenging questions I got, which are like, oh, well, what are Hindus doing with deities at the temple and believing that God's in that? I try to
Hmm.
explain, well, that's not really what the belief is anyway. But I could have
Hmm.
imagined in a Hindu context if you said that people get nuts and raisins, as you often do, and it was just a Hindu belief that
Hmm.
the Hindus believed that there was God in those nuts and raisins, that would have otherwise been dismissed as a pagan belief. And yet, in the context of Catholic doctrine, like that is actually a pretty essential element of Catholic doctrine, is that the
Hmm.
doctrine of transubstantiation says that Catholics believe that and ought to believe that that is the body and blood of Christ.
Hmm.
How do you sort of resolve, that framing of it as I just laid out?
Well, the belief comes from our Lord's teaching, which is most clearly laid out um, in John chapter 6, where he says, "Unless you eat my flesh, drink my blood, that you don't have salvation." And um, it was a shocking at the time. His hearers at the time
Mhm.
were like, "What is he talking about?" So, but the interesting thing is that when you know there are moments where he speaks figuratively. He makes it clear that when he
Yeah.
says something, he doesn't it's a figure of speech. But on this one, he doubles down and triples down and makes it
Yeah.
clear that he means it literally. And so it is a matter of faith to have faith is a gift, and it's something you accede to. It comes to you
Yeah.
by a gift of grace, and it's not. However, I mean, in terms of then trying to explain it in subsequent centuries, the church turned to the concept of transubstantiation and just the difference between forms and substances, what's essential, what's an appearance, etc., drawn from Greek philosophy to try to explain it as much as it can be explained in terms of natural reason. But ultimately,
Mm.
it is a matter of faith, and
Mhm.
you can, to some extent, you can reason through it, as the church has, by using the concept of transubstantiation and substances and appearances, this kind of Aristotelian philosophy that the church deployed. But it can only go so far, and there is that element of faith, right? And
Yeah, that's it's not
this is
reason. It's not you're not trying. You can't reason your way into a faith based conviction.
yes,
I
yes. But
agree with
I
that
will say,
wholly.
from my own experience, when I was drawn to the Catholic Church, and this is in my early 30s, about a decade ago.
Yeah.
I would go to mass, and I had what's called a kind of Eucharistic hunger. Like, I was really, in a way that I couldn't explain, I wanted to partake of that, and I was sort of jealous of the people who were allowed to go up and
Mhm.
receive communion. So, um, but that's not something I can fully explain.
Rationalize.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Right. Right.
yeah.
Right. 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 No, I've enjoyed the conversations I've had as well, being I think healthily challenged on elements of my own faith, but I think about applying that standard. I think is actually interesting universally in discussions about faith cannot be reasoned into on either side of that line of
However,
discussion.
I hope you won't ask me about Hinduism, because I'll be completely honest. It's one of the world religions that is the most sort of, it's a lacuna in my reading. Like, I just some
Well, we'll save it.
stereotypical
We'll save.
things we know. Like,
Why
I
don't
would
we?
be
Indiana
difficult for
Jones and
me
the
to
Temple of Doom
engage
or
with
something.
Hinduism.
uh, well, I think I'd enjoy. We bookmarked this conversation for immigration, so we better get there. But maybe we'll save a future discussion about the comparisons and contrasts, perhaps, of Hindu theological structure and Catholic, and more broadly Christian theological structure. I would enjoy that because I think you are deeply thoughtful about the basis for your own faith convictions. And I was also happen to have been educated in Catholic school and really enjoyed and engaged with a lot of Catholic philosophy and Aquinas on down. So we'll reserve that for future conversation we're going to have. Let's get to where we left off last week, however, which was on the question of trade and industrial policy that brought us to the doorstep now of immigration policy. So what do you think is the right framework for America First for policy to approach the question of legal immigration? And I'll give you one more piece of backdrop from which I asked that question. We sometimes use the vehemence of our shared opposition to illegal immigration, like all conservatives, and even many other non-conservatives too, are vehemently opposed to illegal immigration on grounds that it's a violation of the rule of law, which of course it is. But we use the vehemence of our shared opposition to illegal immigration to obfuscate, and if we're being perfectly honest, even sweep under the rug some deep-seated disagreements that I think we actually do have on the right about what the proper legal immigration policies ought to be. I have my own views of what the goals of our legal immigration policies ought to be, and I can share those with you, but I first want to hear yours, right? What do you think constitutes proper America First immigration policy when it comes to reforming our legal immigration system without necessarily delving into our ritual rejections and condemnations of illegal immigration, which we do too often?
Yep. So I draw my views from the great reactionary sage Ann Coulter, who wrote a few years ago, wrote, quote, "Legal immigration has costs. Immigrants with relatively low education and skills may compete for jobs and public services with the most vulnerable of Americans, particularly those who are unemployed or underemployed. Jobs generated by immigrants' businesses do not always address this problem. Concentrated and or rapid entry of legal immigrants into a locality may impose immediate net costs, particularly in education funding, et cetera, et cetera." So actually, that was not Ann Coulter, as you can imagine, because the prose should have given it away. It was so kind of
Yeah.
wonky. But it was a Democrat. It was Barbara Jordan, who was a member of
Uh-huh.
Congress in the from Texas. She was a protege of Lyndon B. Johnson, the first African American woman elected to the Texas state legislature since Reconstruction, and the first African American member of female member of Congress since Reconstruction as well. So, what I'm trying to suggest is the
I'm
view
not
that,
shocked. That sounds like a perfectly consistent Democrat view.
well, it was
Because
in the
I'm not shocked
90s.
by
It
that.
was
Yeah.
in the as recently as the
Yeah.
90s or early 2000s. You would hear someone like her or Paul Krugman. Actually, there are there are
Mhm.
immigration restrictionist columns by Paul Krugman, which I've pointed it out to him. Because I do this
Or
immigration
even like
debate.
Bernie Sanders, for that matter, who ran
Of
for
course,
president
Bernie
as
Sanders
recently
was
as
the
2020.
last of them. As recently as
Yeah.
2015, he was saying stuff like this.
As
But
recently as 2020, even maybe a little bit, when he ran. I mean, as recently as 2016. That's right. In 2020, when he
yeah,
supported
in
Biden,
2020
maybe you,
they bullied the
yeah,
left, the kind of progressive wing bullied Sanders into
to
adopting
shut up a little bit. Yeah.
to shut up, yeah, on this issue. So,
Yeah.
so here's my view, and I think from what we spoke last time, I think we may have agreement on this. We'll see.
Mhm.
I think that fundamentally, the question we need to ask with immigration policy is, how does it strategically serve the interests of the United States? In other words, the
Mhm.
interests of the country comes before the interests of of any class, especially of immigrants. And I say that as someone who is an immigrant himself,
100%, by the way.
right?
100%.
And so our interest is not necessarily in reunifying families all the time, yet that is the basis of our immigration policy. So there's about 1 million newcomers a year that are legally accepted into this country. Of those, roughly 2/3 are various forms of family reunification, whereas only about the yeah, depending on the categories, let's say 80 to 120,000, are employment-based legal migration. And then you have various other categories of refugee resettlements, humanitarian assistance. And those are, of course, in part, the United States has to do because it's bound by international law. But my point is that the share of immigrants that we accept on the basis of what they actually add to our economy, and even those, I'll maybe argue a little bit to say that we are too loosey goosey with it. But assuming even all those people add to the economy is too low. And so
Mhm.
I favor moving toward something like a points based or skills based system like they have in many other comparable developed countries like Canada, like Britain, that judges people based on what skills they bring. And by the way, even in terms of skills they bring, we have to think, what are the things where we have to do our own native workforce development before we turn to bringing in outsiders. But the basic line here is a strategic immigration policy cannot be a family reunification policy. I have been one, because I do these debates on campuses, college campuses all the time. And I'm accused of hypocrisy on this front, and I'll just own up to it. I came to this country thanks to what's called the family preference visa program, chain migration, you know. But at the end of the day, I then became an American. I have, like, Iran is a distant thing to me, and I care about the well-being of this country. And even though I'm a
Mhm.
family reunification migrant, I'll put my cards on the table and say that family reunification is not good for the common good of this country.
Yeah.
Because it brings in too many low-skilled migrants who, I can show you study after study over their lifetimes, even if they do work, do not contribute enough in taxes to make up for the social services they use. So that's my
So, a
basic
number
stance.
of responses. Yeah, yeah, very good. Number of responses to what you said. First of all, I find that sort of personal hypocritical allegation to be completely unpersuasive and hollow and uninteresting. I mean,
Thank you.
just because a lot of people on the left would say that they need to raise tax rates. I don't think that somebody means somebody is a hypocrite because they only paid the amount of taxes that were actually due, right? There's a separate debate about what the laws should be versus abiding by the laws as they exist. You see this coming up in certain circles today about early voting, right? I think we need single day voting on election day as a national holiday. Do I think Republicans should vote early in order to win this election, potentially be in a position to change those rules? Yes, I do. And I don't think that that's some kind of the allegation of hypocrisy to play by the rules as they exist, but still have an alternative vision to change them to what they should be. I think is kind of unworthy of further engagement. Okay, so next time somebody tells you that, don't. My advice would be spend the airtime on more productive conversation about what our immigration policy should be. On the second point, I would say that we are in deep agreement that the sole objective of U.S. immigration policy should be to ask the question of what advances the interests of America. But I'd be, if I may just hone that slightly, not only the interest of America in some vague sense, because then that runs into a circular question of what is America? Does it include the immigrants who have come here? Is it inclusive of them or not? No. I would say what advances the interests of the American citizens who are already here. That should actually be the sole purpose of immigration policy. Is there's a class of people in America called the United States citizens. You and I are among them, but so are many other people who aren't the kids of immigrants or themselves immigrants. That class of people who are the citizens of the United States of America, the sole purpose of our immigration policy should ask the question of what advances the interests of those citizens who are already here. And I think the meat of this actually comes to the separate question of what does skilled immigration actually, what ought skilled immigration look like? But before we get there, you raised the very practical point that that's not where most illegal immigration is today anyway. It's more chain migration or family reunification. And though you and I come down on the same side of this question, which is that that's not really compatible with a merit-based framework for immigration, to just air the argument for the other side of both of us, right? So I'm not on the other side of you on this, but to air the other side's argument and to maybe hear your response from it, the most interesting version of the other side, at least, is how can people like you and I call ourselves pro-family in America, to believe that the family unit is the foundational bedrock of creating a great country, to say that somebody's going to come here as a skilled worker because they're going to add value to the US, but not also stand by our pro-family value set when it comes to allowing that family unit. Either you believe the nuclear family and the family unit is the most important backbone for building a great nation, or you don't, but you can't really have it both ways when we're talking in different contexts. What would be your response to that objection if it were raised to your and my view here?
Yeah. So okay. So what would limiting the question is what would limiting family reunification look
Right.
like? I think, for example, the Barbara Jordan Commission's the bit that I read was from a report she did, commissioned by the Clinton administration for the U.S. Commission on Immigration Reform, and she was the chairwoman. And her stance was, look, yes, Americans are family people. We there's that component of family values. So it's about her recommendation, which I think is reasonable, though I think people maybe who are harder to my right on immigration would disagree, is only immediate nuclear family reunification. We get that, right? So, like, if a husband or wife comes over, you know,
Or kids,
or kid,
or their kids. Yeah.
you know, for uh, we bring them over for jobs purposes, but they say you can't bring your family. That's if you agree that they add on the skills side, then that, but further than that, like siblings
Yeah.
and it goes out with many layers. It's why it's called chain migration. I would limit that. So I think that's just a reasonable way to balance
And
the two things.
just very practically, here, because it's a question of when the nuclear family ends, right? Like when you're 5 years old, your 3-year-old brother is part of your nuclear family. At what point is your brother not part of your nuclear family on the line you would draw?
Adulthood.
18. Yeah.
I
Okay.
guess,
Got
yeah.
it. So if you're an
Yeah.
adult, a sibling
Yeah,
doesn't count.
I mean, the nuclear
And once you're not,
family is the definition of nuclear family is pretty. It's like like nowadays we have same-sex
mom,
marriage,
dad,
and
kids.
but mom, dad, kids.
Yep. Mom, dad, kids.
Nowadays we would be like
And so,
dad, kids as well. I disagree with that, but it's a reality.
yeah, that's a separate discussion for
Yeah.
another orthogonal to this.
Yes.
And then just to finish the practical laying out of what nuclear family means, does mom, dad, kids, does that framework go away if mom and dad no longer included when you're 18 as well?
Uh, I'm sorry. Can you
Like, let's say
repeat
you're
that?
22. Yeah. Just because I think we use, I'm a big fan of clarity of definitions, right? And
Yeah.
we use the word nuclear family. So let's just say somebody immigrates at the age of 25.
Hmm.
I think it counts, to me, I think it would be chain migration to say that their parents, just because that person becomes a naturalized citizen, that
Oh,
somehow
right.
that
Yeah,
that
yeah, yeah.
gives
Of
their
course, of
parents,
course.
yeah,
Okay, then no elderly parent. I mean, that's a sorry, but that's a classic case of people who will come, who
chain.
will, and they'll come just when they need social services without having contributed
Mhm.
taxes. Right.
Yeah.
That's
So
pretty.
so so
That's pretty
and then
unfair
you
to
and you
existing
went right
citizens.
to and you went right to the question I was going to go to next is how would your view on this change if there was a hard ban or prohibition on being a customer of the welfare state in any form in bringing such person? Does that change the balance of what you believe on this question of chain migration?
It would not, because I care about the labor market effects, which would not, it would not fundamentally change that. What I mean by labor market effect is when you bring
Yeah.
unskilled workers to the United States, they typically have lower education and they have less bargaining power in the work. They're more desperate, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
When you bring them in, that puts downward pressure on the wages of native born workers, U.S. citizens. And
Yeah.
so,
So let me tell you what I think is going on in this discussion, if I
yeah,
may, because I think I just really want to track this. One is the macro point, which I think you and I agree with, is we use the vehemence of our opposition to illegal immigration to confound our disagreements on this question of
sure.
legal immigration. But I think there's a second layer of that waterfall that's also happening,
Yeah.
which we use the effect of this chain migration in the dominant form of legal immigration in this country that you and I are both opposed to
Hmm.
use that to confound something else that's going on in this debate that we're not actually willing to usually smoke out, but I'd like to with you if you're willing,
Hmm.
which is that, yes, okay, there's too much chain migration. You and I agree on that. But
Hmm.
that confounds a really separate lurking debate too, which is this question about the effect on American workers' wages.
Hmm.
And then you use the word unskilled. I suspect, and I don't know if this is your view,
Hmm.
but I wonder and think it might be, although you can clarify that. But certainly it is a new right view, a NatCon view,
Hmm.
or a immigration protectionist view to say that even if it was skilled, right, we need to cap the number of people who are coming from Asian countries or India or whatever to be computer programmers in Silicon Valley. Like we got too many of them. And so, like, I would rather, for the purpose of clarity and arriving at future policy, be able to just talk about that in the open rather
Hmm.
than sort of pinning it on illegal or then chain migration or then this question of unskilled. Because I don't think that's actually really where the meat of the divide really is. I think if
Well,
we're
I
talking
would
about
say
like mass numbers of skilled, I think there's a lot of
yeah.
opponents to that too, right?
Well, when you're talking about the pro-immigration side, the non-restrictionist side, unskilled is a pretty big issue. The numbers are just
Yeah.
so. I don't think. But then when you get into the nitty-gritty of debates on the right, you know, yes, I mean, I think people maybe do tend to brush the skilled aspect under the rug of these other things
Right.
where we clearly agree. So let's get into it. Um,
I'd rather go to the disagreement area rather than just using vehement
yeah.
agreements, right?
So
Yeah, where we agree on
uh,
90% of this stuff.
sure, sure. So like we have to think about this again strategically and sort of plan and think about whether or not the workers who are marketed as skilled workers are ones which the domestic workforce could not otherwise supply to our employers.
Okay.
And so, you know, so for example, that's why I did respectfully like disagree vehemently with President Trump when he went on a podcast. I doubt it will become policy, but he said anyone who gets at least an associate's degree, the 2-year degree, we will staple a green card. Okay, like we have people with associate's degrees who need work, and they would be considered in various contexts skilled workers, but they're not gonna. They're like our own domestic workforce. So it has to be like legitimately difficult sort of skills that are as we try to ramp up our own workforce development, we cannot supply to employers right now. I get that. I think that's fine. And just there's no way around that. But I will say that there are categories of workers who are barred over as high skilled workers where it's just displacing domestic workers, and it cuts against the principle that you rightly laid out, that it should be the well-being of existing US citizens. So when you
Yeah.
have, for example, companies, tech companies who bring in an H-1B workforce, and H-1B, I realize, is not the same as immigration per se, but still, they bring them in to train their own existing domestic workforce, to get trained by their existing domestic workforce. And once the training program is over, they usher the domestic workers out, and this happens. This has happened,
And
and it's
why
a
do you think they're doing that? And why do you think they're
because it's
like
because
in this
H-1B workers are first of all, it can be cheaper, but second of all, H-1B workers are actually, it's a
in
kind
the
of
tech sector? Might it be because some of them are also more effective at carrying out the job?
I don't think. Well, I'll get to that one second, but I think
Yeah.
that the main advantage is, honestly, it's a kind of indentured servitude, because in that
Oh,
case,
it's a horrible program.
you
It's a
you
horrible
are
program.
you
I
are
agree with you.
you are you have no bargaining power because the employer controls your visa.
Oh, I mean, I've spoken about this extensively, Sohrab. Like this indentured. I mean, the
Okay, good,
H-1B
good.
program is like horribly
Okay,
administered. It's
thank
just
you. I agree. I
I'm no
agree.
defender of the H-1B program, but I want to go
But
to the
then
first principle because
on the skills
yeah,
point too, there's something revealing in the facts. So there are actually four categories of H-1B visas. The top two are, the top one is literally for genius level. It's supposed to be, right? Like really, really skilled, unique skill set, etc. The second one is also very typically
and on
high.
there you would agree unlimited numbers would be good in that first category.
As long as there is a parallel program for workforce development so that we can begin to supply these, we have to have engineering schools. We have to fill our engineering schools. And that means reforming K through 12 so that when kids come out, not only can they do freaking basic math, but are able to get into
Right.
engineering
This is the
schools.
part I kind of want
Yeah.
to start at the end of the waterfall because like
Yeah.
we end up on other parts of the
But
waterfall. Like, in some ways we
can
start at
I
the end of
just,
the waterfall
Vivek?
on that one though on that
Yeah.
one which is where I think the rubber really hits the road. Are you in favor of like let's just take the what you call the genius category, one the
Uh-huh.
highest on the hierarchy of four categories of H-1B? In there, are you in favor of uncapped numbers? If there are immigrants who fit that criteria, and I'm a little bit more hawkish than you actually, I would add one more criteria, which is love of country and national identity and civic engagement and ability to speak English. I would add that to workforce contribution, but
Well,
put
when
that
you're
to one
talking at
side.
that level, they tend to
Yeah,
be easy to assimilate, high
yeah, they
educated
easy to
people. So
eliminate.
okay.
But in that
But
category, like, yeah, what are you uncapped there?
as long as there is parallel efforts to do workforce development so that we are able to
See, I don't
produce
see that
that level.
caveat. I don't get that caveat because here's why. Because that you're talking about like K through 12. That's not intention within the present, bringing in the Elon Musk class of person. And
Yeah.
the idea of saying that you're going to say no to one Elon Musk person because you don't have K through 12 development is like comparing apples and oranges to me.
Okay, so I would go with you, and I'll concede that, like, yes, but I would just say that, when we say unlimited, actually the number of people who really fit into that category is pretty small. And here's the point I was trying to make: the next two levels
Mm.
of H-1B really aren't that skilled. All they offer is that they're relatively cheaper because they're used to lower wages in their own home countries, or they can't get work in their home countries, or they're just like easier to oppress in a management employment
Yeah.
context. And like, they are not geniuses, right? That's here's the key fact that's a scandal. Guess what two categories get used a lot more? It's not the genius level, or it's not
Yeah.
you know it's like the basic ones that are primarily used by tech companies. So, yeah, i
Yeah.
I have
And how would
issues
you
with that.
describe those two categories for the
There's
description
just
of the
they're
benefit of
skilled
the audience?
workers. They have bachelor's
Skilled workers.
degrees
Yeah.
from they have bachelor's degrees from like Chinese universities or Indian universities, whatever.
Yeah.
And but like our economy does produce people like that. And sometimes those people then who are domestic US workers get displaced in this outrageous way where they train their own replacements.
Yeah.
That's just pure
I guess like for
exploitation.
companies
Yeah.
in a competitive market, like what is their self-interest in going out of their way to go through what are some bureaucratic hurdles, some additional legal compliance hurdles to still say I would rather choose that worker rather than a native born one? Like what accounts for that decision? You could start with the premise that they're just hostile to the country. They hate the United States of America and the
Oh,
corporation. But I just don't think that's what's going on,
I don't think
right?
it's true. I think
Yeah.
it's just I just it's a story as old as time. Capital has a tendency, um, it always wants to lower labor costs. It's just that
Mhm.
is, and
That's right. I
right?
agree with you. That's what it's about.
That's all. That's at stake. But
And
that
so
doesn't
and so
mean
is it
that that
inconsistent?
drive to
Yeah.
always lower labor costs is necessarily consistent with American national interest. So that's that.
Mhm.
In some cases, look, you want to make it possible, but
So when we talk about American national interest, I want to talk a little bit about what's included in there, because clearly you have pointed to one area where it could arguably not be in the American national interest, which is in the wages that American-born workers are able to command
hmm
in those same roles, which is an interesting
hmm
point you've put your finger on.
hmm
I do think that it is a little bit of an assertion to therefore conclude that that is the totality of what we determine counts as the American national interest. Because I do find myself sometimes frustrated listening to the screeds of people on our own side of this talking about this question and saying that we need to make sure that those companies are paying higher wages and we aren't replacing somebody with the same person can do the job $2 more cheaply for at least as good of a quality and work harder for longer hours. That we don't want that to happen, but we're also going to lambast Biden Harris inflation, right? I mean, what do you think? What do you think is the net effect of restricting a company's ability to bring down its marginal cost in an otherwise competitive market? I think you are somewhat restricted in your ability to just mouth off about inflation while talking about this is a problem at the same time without recognizing there's some tension between those two
yeah.
points of view. And you're smart enough to level with
Okay,
that.
so look, I think it's and Jerome Powell does this as much as anyone is to
Yeah.
blame inflation primarily on wage price inflation and ignore the other sort of um, bottlenecks that have built up in the American economy, where even where we're investing in XYZ industry, um, because we've lost, and this goes back to the earlier debate, because we've lost the industrial capacity, because we've lost the industrial know-how, because, and I hear this from employers all the time, I hear patriotic employers who listen to my message on industrial policy and things like this, and they'll say, hey, like, I'm with you on this stuff, but you know what problem I have trouble finding workers who can stay sober from 9 to 5. And it breaks my heart when I hear that, but I know it's true and they mean it. But why is that happening? Is because we've neglected this stuff for so long. So I just think that it's a mistake to just say, like,
I
what
don't
is
know.
the
I don't
one
know if
thing?
that's why it's happening. I don't know why it's happening.
What is the
Yeah.
only driver of wage price of inflation is wage price inflation? I think is a mistake. There are other
I don't
bottle
think it's the only driver. I don't think it's the only
right,
driver at
but
all. I think
sometimes
it would be a
it's
mistake.
treated that way, and it helps the employer class to just focus on that
Yeah.
in at the expense of all else. But look,
But I'm asking
like
you, and because
here's the
that's
other
a
thing.
straw man,
Sure.
version of that
I don't
argument.
know.
But
Wait,
let's
here.
just say it was a component, because I think you and I would agree.
It's a
I mean,
component. Yeah.
obviously, it's not negligible. So when you're talking about the American national interest, how does one, even in a framework, when you're thinking about the government, and as you know, I'm a little bit of a skeptic of this about the fatal
Yeah.
conceit of any central planner being able to weight all of this. But suppose you want some central planner, or at least a central body, to be able to weight this of what's in the national interest. How do
Mhm.
you weight the effect on American workers, of whom fewer than would be hired by the company, but at least they'd be American born, which is a pro American national interest. I'll grant that. How do you
Mhm.
weigh that against the incremental effect that that would have on the cost that those same American workers are paying when they go to the store to buy
Yeah.
a T-shirt or get a haircut?
Well, if you have a higher wage economy as a whole, and again, this is why my immigrate my immigration restrictionism is part of a broader package of what I think the political economy as a whole should look like. Then you have an economy in which wages can absorb higher prices here or there, right? So that um, if you have, for example, a revival of manufacturing, you push up the manufacturing share of the workforce. Those jobs tend to be higher wages, and then those workers can pay a little bit more for the haircut. But so, like, what I'm trying to tell you though is I grant you that um, some of the measures that I'm talking about will mean a more expensive country at the consumer level. I'm
I
not going to
appreciate the
deny that
honesty. I
entirely.
mean, that's
I'm not
that's
going to
yeah.
deny
Thank you for
that.
not
I'm
denying
not going to
that, so we can
deny
have a
that
clear
either, but I would
discussion.
just say
Yeah.
that Americans, here's the national interest point, is that Americans' lives as workers and producers are just as important as our lives as consumers. And for too long, policy as a whole, not just Republicans, not just Democrats, the center elite has emphasized everything at the level of consumption. Well, we're getting cheaper. This is, not realizing the ramifications of the inability to produce. I'm not even talking about the fact we don't produce. Because we've neglected it for so long, we've lost kind of a competent workforce, and then we have to turn to immigration. So that's what I'm saying. Like, let's think about that, and let's think about the costs that are associated with just an emphasis on Americans' consumption patterns, and the neglect of our ability to produce. And immigration is a key part of this, because if we always bring in, so think about it, like, you don't want a future in which China or even India have like all the engineering schools that actually produce, and like, our workers, what paths do they follow? Is like finance, kind of entertainment and soft creative fields, or precarious services jobs. Those are the options. And then when we need engineers,
I agree with you
turn to
wholeheartedly on that.
Chinese universities.
I agree with you wholeheartedly on we don't want the United States to become the backwater of like people who are only PR and communications.
We're
majors
kind of
like
on the way that we're at risk of going down the value chain.
So I just worry that further pretending like those other engineering minds don't exist elsewhere in the world is actually going to make us less prepared, not more prepared, to be able to actually meet the standards that the rest of the world sets. And I don't want to be a frog in the well, to use the old expression.
And that's why I said we should
know.
attract those genuinely high skilled people, but be wary of people who definitely whose skills we could either have already in the existing workforce, or we could develop in quick order. Why bring in immigrants for that, other than just to let people, So that would be the judgment call.
So that means from a first principles, like I'm no defender of the current immigration system. I think it's broken, including the H-1B system and everything else. But if you're drawing up from a whiteboard, because I think in some ways you got to know what target you're solving for before you debate implementation. And I think part of what happens in this is I think that we conflate, not you and I, but I think the broader debates conflate a discussion about implementation when in fact you're using that to joust over alternative goals. So once you have your goals set, then at least you can work back to your implementation. So on your view of it, in principle, if you have immigrants who are going to add more value to the United States of America by working harder, being more industrious, being more intelligent or innovative, and love the country more, know about its civic history, better at speaking English than the modal or even median native-born American in the similar shoe here, a merit-based immigration system would welcome the immigrants who fit the categories that I just checked off.
I think that's not an unfair description. Again, I would just
and less likely, I would add less likely to be a customer of the welfare state as well. Yeah.
I would just add that the numbers needn't be as big as employers would want. Right? Employers will want to shoehorn people who don't necessarily fit that category into the one.
Forget that's an implementation question. Without the shoehorning,
I'm willing.
Without
to
the shoehorning,
sure.
You would say that you would in fact for that category you would go so far as to say, on your view, apply no cap to the number of such immigrants who would come. Now, list the criteria for you again, which are, because I think it smokes out a deeper question that I'd love to at least have on the table so we can see it with clear eyes. Love of country, civics test, knowledge of U.S. constitutional principles and value, U.S. law, history, competency in English, proficiency in English, ability to make contributions to the country, high skills, willingness to work hard, and unlikelihood of ever being a customer of the U.S. welfare state. On those metrics,
I love all of those. I love all of those, but where you said high skilled, I would just, if I may, just refine a little bit. High skilled the sense that they possess skills that the domestic workforce currently doesn't have in sufficient numbers, given any given sector,
or quality,
or that. Well, quality, I don't know. It goes into like how hard work. I think Americans are really hardworking people, the hardest working in the world.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just somebody who's also been a business owner, so I just want to, I come from the standpoint of like who's going to be the best person to do that job, but fills all of the other criteria, including love of country, proficiency in English, unlikely to be a customer of the welfare state, all of that.
That we don't have the skills. We don't have the skills in sufficient numbers given the sector, and we cannot that the ramp up time for domestic workforce development is too long, and in the meanwhile the sector would face problems. And so they're like, sure.
Not the sector would face
And
problems. Take that one off the table. Take the sector would face problems, because what does problems mean versus like success in a business or economic sector is scalar. It's not a binary of you're doing well or you have a problem. It's a question of how well you want to be doing, and you want to be the outer doing of well. So it's not a quantum category. It's a scalar category. And so if you take, not to say that the industry would be in trouble, but like we want it to be doing as well as possible in the United States of America, but you have immigrants who fit all of those criteria. In theory, on your view, you would be uncapped on that number.
Yep. But so now let's go back. Let's go to the real world, right? I think the CHIPS Act is partly an achievement. I think the Biden CHIPS Act is good, but there's enormous like things
You and I disagree on that. Yeah.
the things that piss you off. The Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, the TSMC,
Yeah.
has brought in builders to for the plant manufacture to Arizona. Arizona has good unionized builders, and of course, the unions in Arizona are fighting back against this. But just like, um,
one of the things they would tell you, this may make you upset, Sohrab, but one of the things they would tell you, and I can't attest to this being true, but one of the things they would tell you is the difference in the Taiwanese worker who comes here versus the American worker is like the nature of manufacturing these semiconductors is itself an innovative art of itself. And in TSMC in Taiwan
I
can
agree.
get to like
We don't
leading
have
edge
the we don't have the
semiconductors.
plant. Sure. So okay. So let me revise that. You're
Let
right.
me just finish the point, because I want you to make sure you understand what I'm about to say, which is a little bit provocative, but I think it's what they would say. So I want to get the view on the table. Is not just that we've failed to train the American workers on how to know how to build that leading edge sub 10 nanometer, sub 5 nanometer semiconductor, okay? But that the cultural attributes of the workers from Taiwan were actually better suited in terms of industriousness, willingness to work hard, and the ability to have the innovative capacity than they are able to find amongst the American workforce. I'm not saying whether that's right or wrong, but what I am saying is that would be a claim that the people who are running into major problems replicating in Arizona what they're able to do in Taiwan would tell you is a rate limiter for what they're able to do.
So I think this goes back to the where I said skills and you said skills and quality, and I'm willing to say, look, we haven't trained our plant fabricators to do the kind of to possess the kind of know-how that's involved in fabricating those kinds of plants, and that's our failing.
Right.
And in the meanwhile, okay, fine, bring your 500 Taiwanese workers. That quality element can sometimes mean it can be a facade for basically saying, well, they're just used to a workforce culture in which the employer wields more bargaining power, and the employee has to just kind of go along. And you call that, oh, what an industrious worker. What you're really doing is saying, we don't want the kind of Western style model of trying to build at least a little bit in the workplace, have relatively equal bargaining power, and the power to coerce doesn't run only in one way, but kind of is mutual or symmetrical. I get a little bit uneasy with language about quality, which to me sounds like just saying like, well,
Let me pull
because
up
that
a
gets to
headline.
China. That goes to China model too, where it's like, well, they sleep at the factory floors. Like what great workforce. I don't like it when Elon says this. It's like, well, we've made achievements of workers' rights in this country that we should be proud of.
Let's take the Chinese and Asian dimension out. So I'm going to just read you a headline. I actually just saw this last week. So I picked up my phone to read you the exact headline. It was from a European CEO talking about America. Okay, here's what he says, his exact quote. Quote unquote, Americans just work harder than Europeans, says CEO of Norway's $1.6 trillion oil fund, because they have, quote, a higher general level of ambition. So in his case, he's accounting. In that case, we're trying on it's a different comparison here. But he would say the reason that the United States of America and the companies here are just more successful than their European counterparts, apples to apples, in many cases, is because of that cultural attribute of American exceptionalism and the willingness to work hard and self-determination, and the cultural willingness to do that here.
Right. So that what you described is something to talk about scalar. What you described is something that lies on a spectrum. And you just said American workers, which I agree. I think American workers
compared to
if you
Europeans. Yep, compared to
yeah,
Europeans
but if you
right here.
give them a fair deal and the training, and you don't have a society that's just pulled every rug from under them, American
But part
workers
of that
are
training,
just
Sohrab, is actually.
exceptional. Yeah.
Well, I tend to agree with you. That's why I'm telling you that. And that's why
So
when I go to
I
Europe,
don't
I'm
want
not
them
afraid
like
to give
compared
them bitter
to
medicine.
compare. Sorry, but it bothers me when it's like compared to countries that maintain sweatshop conditions, and workers haven't made the gains
But
of the past century or
but
so.
the
It's like
TSMC,
to
but to
use that
push on that, because I
against.
hear this.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
know this form of argument, the sweatshop argument, and I think this happens up and down the immigration discussion where we use one example to obfuscate,
Hmm.
an adjacent issue that actually where the action is. So here on this TSMC point, TSMC is not having those. I mean, these are not assembly line workers that are being whipped on the back to
No,
churn
I know,
out
I
stuff
know,
in
I know,
like
I
a.
know, I know.
These are geniuses in their own right, right? These are the people who are creating the innovation of how we're actually fabricating semiconductors with a slightly smaller width, right? Nanometer difference, which has
I get
huge
it. I get it.
implications for the utility of these chips. So we can't use the sweatshop condition point on the culture point. What I'm saying is America relative to Europe and our culture of ingenuity that has made US prosperity greater than that of Europe's over the last 60 years, driving to what I think are some fundamental cultural differences between the United States and Europe. That I think, if we're really being honest, is a little bit of what's going on with respect to certain other sectors from Taiwan, China, India, where you have, when I use the word quality, a kind of cultural competition in terms of innovation. Not somebody who's working in sweatshop conditions. That's a little bit of, that's a separate debate. It's adjacent, but we can't use that to sweep this other difference under the rug, because it's literally the ones that the people in TSMC Arizona would tell you is a difference, is the quality of those Taiwanese workers who are able to do it in a way that American-born can.
Hmm.
And I'm with you in wanting America to be the country that produces them, but I think we're more likely to get there, not less, if we actually open our eyes to what the best and brightest actually look like, rather than shielding ourselves with tunnel vision like a frog in the well. I don't want America to become the Great Britain of the next 2 centuries, of a decaying, elegant empire that's just in decline. And
Hmm.
I think that with those shared goals of advancing the American national interest, it's not that I view some other ideology of like
Yeah.
free trade and labor or whatever as an alternative to what is in the American national interest, but I think it is an alternative vision of what actually constitutes the wholer American national interest.
Hmm.
That, especially in this question of immigration, we'll go to the illegals, we'll go to the chain migration, we'll go to the sweatshop conditions, but sidestep what I do think is a real rubber hitting the road in the America First right, which is, I think, part of what's guiding this. Part of what's guiding you, maybe I can't speak to you, but part of what's guiding the viewpoint of protectionism in this question is actually kind of a blood and soil view too. That the idea that
Mm.
you have too
I,
many of a certain number that come in has a dilutive effect. I do think that's lurking underneath the surface, and it's just
I
worth at least acknowledging it.
yeah, completely reject the blood and soil characterization. I don't know how much you follow my work,
Not
but
characterization, but the argument. Not, maybe it's not your.
that's what's
That,
lurking behind my case. Because look, like I said, I'm an
maybe not your
immigrant.
case. Yeah, maybe not your case.
I'm an
Yeah,
immigrant,
your case.
born in the United States that
I don't think
immigrates
blood
here.
and soil is bad,
Look,
by the way. I'm not saying that's bad. I think it's just it's a view to know that there's too much demographic change too quickly on its own terms.
yeah,
That is itself a goal to avoid. Which, if it is, we can debate that. But let's at least
yeah.
get it on the table, because I do think that that's in the discussion, and we would do better to have
No,
a clearer discussion of
I've
policy if we acknowledge
whenever
that's an
I've
objective.
debated immigration against the left, I make almost exclusively economic arguments, and what I love to do is like I said, point out how the views that I represent, I think actually President Trump represents, was like the Democratic Party norm as recently as the 1990s or the
1990s,
aughts,
yeah, Bill Clinton.
or the aughts. But look, I think that I think we agreed on the definition of how to deal with the kind of skilled question, right? Like
Sure.
we can, okay, at some point we'll run up against like the skills and qualities. And I just want to emphasize skills. You want to do skills and quality. Okay, whatever. That's like a marginal thing we can. So I think we reached a good place on that.
Yeah,
The kind of uncapped when it
I agree.
comes to that kind of person. On this question of like uh, you know, the pace of demographic change, I think it's an issue that we should be able to honestly talk about. And
Yeah, I
in
agree.
Europe, the inability to honestly talk about it has led to a lot of these kind of bottled up social tensions.
Totally.
And if we aren't able to talk about it honestly, I actually worry that like the next version of American populism will be like really scary, right? Because it's been bottled up and people are, and like
Totally.
People like
I'm with you on that.
you and me will have to like form a united front against like Nazis, with the left. And I don't want that situation to come around, right? But in order to do that, we have to address common concerns. And I think, again, just to go back to the bigger framing, my main thing is to cut down on family reunification and go more towards skills and point space, which will mean
We're
smaller
on the
numbers.
same page. We're on the same page.
And if we do that, then I think it kind of addresses the demographic issue. At the same time, like, look, there's a lot of immigration and just race discourse on the right, which I like. People say, "Oh, it's just the fringes stuff." There's some really, really ugly stuff out there against Indian Americans.
I don't even want to call it ugly. I don't even want to call it ugly. Let's just get it on the table so we know what we're solving for. Because I do think that there's and the more you bottle it up, the uglier then it then becomes. Versus a legitimate concern to say, people don't look the way that I'm used to them looking 40 years ago. I don't want to say that you're a racist for saying that. I'd like to get that on the table to say that that is a consideration, because what ends up happening,
I totally agree. I'm agreeing with you. I think that should be
because
for democratic
you're super intellectually honest, but I think part of what ends up happening is that for a lot of people on the right who have constructive conversations with, I do think that they're earnest, but that is part of a component of what matters. But then we end up making these like sort of cockamamie second and third rate economic arguments that don't really hold up because we're solving for a slightly different thing.
No. That makes me sound like I'm no,
not yours. But I do think that the quality of this
one is totally a germane economic argument. That
I agree with that. But
everyone says even if we go to even if we increase the manufacturing share of the GDP, it won't necessarily the manufacturing share of the workforce won't budge. It might still be the same because of automation. So we're saying we're going to have for a lot of Americans, we're going to have a services-based economy, and then we're bringing in unskilled service workers. Why? That makes no sense. And so I think that's a very serious argument and is not a cover for demographic arguments. That's just a purely
we might actually, if you're open to it, we might actually have to have a third one.
Okay, let's do it. Because we do want to get into this demography and the sort of rise.
Because I didn't give you my view, actually. I've been asking you views. I've actually, for the purpose, I have not yet aired what my actually view on the whole question is, which actually relates to a heightened emphasis on national identity. And then what is American national identity, I think, requires being answered before saying if we're going to put a heightened emphasis on national identity, which we're not doing in today's immigration system, what does that actually mean? And I would love to have that discussion with you.
Okay. Yeah. Great.
Yeah. So sounds good, man. This is a lot of fun, and sometime in the coming weeks, at least, I would welcome continuing this because you make me smarter. I appreciate that.
And likewise, you. Thank you.